Hi, I'm Honorary Licensed Battlefield Guide Carol Reardon, and we're in the Soldiers National Cemetery here at Gettysburg. And I want to tell you a very special story about a couple whose road to Gettysburg actually began up in Canada. Louis Torango and his wife Maria were joined in holy wedlock back in 1838. Their union would produce two children, Cordelia and a young son named Peter. But not until after they'd been married for at least a decade. They decided that Canada didn't hold much promise for their growing family, so they moved to New York, up to the area around Albany, where there was a growing and even thriving textile manufacturing going on. They settled in the little town of Cohoes, and the town itself developed a special nickname. They called it the Spindle City. It was there about 24 years after they had been married that Louis made an unusual decision. Even though he was approaching the age where military service was no longer required of him, he decided that he needed to join the Union Army. In September of 1862, in answer to Abraham Lincoln's call for 300,000 more recruits, he went and he enlisted. Now, perhaps he thought this through, or perhaps it was just a fluke, but he enlisted in the 30th New York Infantry, or so he thought. If he was a calculating sort, and we wish we knew, he probably appreciated that the 30th New York Infantry was a 2-year regiment. Most Union regiments had enlisted for 3 years, but the 30th had only enlisted for 2, and their term of service would be up in May of 1863. If he was fortunate, Louis could enlist in September of 1862, spend several months in winter quarters, and then just be exposed to the dangers of campaigning for a couple of months in the spring. Well, when spring came, when May came, when the 30th New York was discharged from the service, much to his surprise, or maybe shock, or maybe horror, Torango found out that he didn't get to go home with the 30th after all. He had not signed papers that enlisted him in the 30th New York Infantry specifically. He had signed enlistment papers into the United States Army for a term of service of 3 years. He was going to have to finish out his 3 years with some other regiment, with total strangers that he hadn't enlisted with. As it was, he would be transferred to Company E of the 76th New York Infantry. So when it came time for the Battle of Gettysburg, Louis Torango, who expected to be home with his family up in New York, found himself marching on the roads into Pennsylvania and heading out to the first day's battlefield. The 76th New York was in Brigadier General Lysander Cutler's brigade, and Cutler's brigade was the first brigade of infantry, Union infantry, to arrive on the battlefield. They were in John Reynolds' First Corps. They were sent into line around the railroad, the famous railroad cut, and the 76th New York was on the extreme right flank of Cutler's line. Facing them was Brigadier General Joseph R. Davis's Mississippians and North Carolinians. And in fact, it was the 55th North Carolina directly confronting the 76th New York. The 55th North Carolina was a very big regiment, and sooner or later, its left flank began to overlap the right flank of the 76th New York. Hit on the front and hit on the flank, the 76th New York's men began to drop in droves. The commanding officer, Major Grover, fell dead. The sergeant major of the regiment, he also fell dead, and the soldiers were dropping one by one very quickly. And among those who fell was Private Torango. Somehow, someway, he was carried over to the Lutheran seminary and became a patient in the hospital there. He would survive for almost 2 months. All the while, his wife, Maria, was beginning to wonder about him. And in fact, she got word in late July that her husband had died. The message probably hit her as a little strange. The message said that he had died of his injuries suffered at Gettysburg, but that he had died in Hanover Courthouse, Virginia. Now, perhaps she just didn't understand military geography, and perhaps she didn't wonder how her husband, wounded in Pennsylvania, had died in a hospital in Virginia, but she accepted her loss, and then she had to figure out how to make do for herself and for her 2 children. Fortunately, there was the possibility of a little bit of help. A year before Gettysburg, on the 14th of July, 1862, Congress had passed a bill that became known as the Widow's Pension Bill. This was essentially survivor benefits for families who had lost a loved one in the service. The process for applying for one was not a simple one. There were a lot of hoops to jump through, and there was nothing automatic about it. In fact, the government didn't come to you and say you have this money coming to you. You had to know that it was available, you had to start the process yourself, and you had to make sure that every stage of the process was followed through completely. She must have been worried about funds because she started the paperwork for her widow's pension on the 3rd of August. Ironically enough, when she applied for her widow's pension, Maria was not yet a widow. Lewis was still alive, here in a Gettysburg hospital, struggling to live. Perhaps if she had known that, maybe she would have come down here to help him, see what she could do. But she did not, and she pushed forward. Torango would die of his injuries in early September, and that's how he would come to be buried here in the Soldiers National Cemetery at Gettysburg. His story ends, but Maria's does not. What she has to do is to keep on top of everything. The first thing she has to do is to prove that her late husband actually was officially enlisted in the United States Army. It seems straightforward enough. You went to the Adjutant General's office, you made a request. All they did was fill out a form saying that, yes, Louis Torango was enlisted as a private in the 76th New York, and that would have taken care of it. Except remember, he is just transferred from the 30th to the 76th, and his paperwork wasn't completely transferred yet. They couldn't track him down. It didn't help that she had made an error. She had said that Torango was in Company H, and he was actually in Company E. The clerks looked on the roster for Company H of the 76, couldn't find Torango, and basically said, can't find him. And they were willing to let the whole matter drop right then. But Maria was persistent. She discovered she made an error, and she finally had the record fixed. But that took her 11 months. 11 months without so much as a nickel for her support. Once they had figured out exactly what regiment and what company that Torango belonged to, then they had to make sure that, in fact, he had died. The Hanover courthouse report puzzled everybody in the records office. This didn't make any sense. And it took until December of 1865 for a soldier who had served with him in the old 30th and had transferred with him to the 76th, a soldier who had been wounded with Torango at Gettysburg, finally wrote an affidavit saying, no, I saw him fall at Gettysburg. He died in the hospital. I was near him when he died. And finally, it took until December of 65 to prove that he had died. The next thing she has to do is prove that, in fact, she was legally married to Private Torango. And that was going to be difficult, too, because this was not an era where marriage licenses were a common thing. Plus the fact they had married back in Canada. And she had to figure out how to get some kind of verification for this. They had been married by a Catholic priest in a little church outside of Montreal, which was then located in a place that was designated as Lower Canada. And Lower Canada had ceased to exist back in 1841. It was difficult to find any kind of a record. But finally, she did get a piece of paper acknowledging the fact that the wedding had taken place. And it was written in French. Anything, it seemed like that could complicate the matter seemed to happen to the poor Torango family. The final thing she had to do was to, in fact, prove that the two children, Cordelia and Peter, were the children of that marriage. By this time, Cordelia had reached the age of 16, and as a result, she could not be considered for any additional funding. She was basically considered an adult on her own. But Maria persisted, at least, in proving that Peter was, in fact, her son with Louis, and produced a baptismal certificate, at least, to verify that. She will finally get her widow's pension, but it will take until June of 1866 before she even sees a dime. Usually the process didn't take that long. Usually you didn't have to jump through nearly that many hoops, but Maria was persistent, and she finally got the widow's pension. We would like to think that this would take care of all the snafus, all the possible errors, all the possible glitches that the Torangos would suffer through. But there was one more. Private Torango's remains were brought here to the National Cemetery, and as they were laying out the graves in the wide semicircle here that surrounds the Soldiers' National Monument, the stonecutters who put the names on the headstones, many of them were recent immigrants who were not familiar with English spellings, English printing, English penmanship, and sometimes they got the names wrong. And so after all of this effort by Louis and Marie Torango to serve their country and to make sure that the family was taken care of, if Maria had ever come down here to find her husband's grave, she would have had a hard time doing it. Because ultimately, when he was laid to rest, he was laid to rest under this headstone here that tells us that he was Private Louis Frento. We have the right regiment. We have other records that verify that, in fact, this is Private Torango, but posterity will come and see him as Frento. Whenever I come to the Soldiers' National Cemetery, I usually stop here and remember him and call him by name, just because fate had not been kind to him. Private Louis Torango, we salute you. I'm Licensed Battlefield Guide Honorary Carol Reardon, and thank you for coming to our cemetery stop today.